Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Right, great. Okay. I just need to get my document out. Okay, well, thank you very much, both Christian and Anne, for the introductions. Just before I start the lecture, just a couple of, for clarification really, I'm not going to be talking much about architecture. So if you're expecting lots of buildings, you're going to be disappointed. But everything I aspire to say, and hopefully with some degree of clarity, has a bearing on architecture in the built environment. That'll be another lecture. But actually, for the benefit of this lecture, I'm looking at a much kind of wider remit of inquiry to do with our understanding or misunderstanding of nature. Essentially, that's the kind of central topic. Also, I just wanted to say that material actually from this lecture has engaged my interest really since I was at London Met, the beginning of my appointment that Anne alluded to, during the period of COVID, coincidentally. And the more I read, the more I realise that I'm completely ignorant of the subject that I'm actually about to present. So please make allowances for some of my hunches, my assumptions, because it's a subject of enormous complexity that no single area of discipline can really fully master and actually understand. So that's one clarification. The other thing I just wanted to say is the material actually I'm presenting also relates to two modules that I taught at postgraduate level at London Met, and I just want to acknowledge the enormous contribution of the students actually on those two modules. One is called appropriately Forgetting of Air, and the question of air comes up a number of times in the lecture. And also another one called Critical Transformations. So those two are actually very, very important in the development of the topic that I'm about to present. So I'm just going to have a glass of water. Okay, so I just want to say that the background to this presentation partly derives from two publications that I did. The first one, Disclosing Horizons, Architecture, Perspective, Redemptive Space. This is my first book, and it really explores issues of the cultural dimensions of perspective, really from the origins of geometry right up to contemporary culture. And it was a book that actually, many of the themes that have came out of this publication, I explore in this particular lecture. Although I don't talk about nature directly in this book, but there are very important references as will become clearer in the lecture. The second book, Architecture and the Language Debate, you'll see that there is a very particular part of this lecture where this particular book has a particular importance. This is my most recent publication, and one that serves as a kind of benchmark really to my interest in language, which has become more and more richer, actually, as I read lots of stuff on language theory as part of the presentation. So that's just a bit of background. So I'm going to read. There's a lot of dense material here, so please excuse some areas where I might go into digressing areas of where maybe the kind of topic may go into various particular minutiae and arguments. The flow of the argument may seem a little incoherent in places. But essentially, I'm going to provide an introduction, and then there are going to be three parts to the main body of the lecture. The first part, appropriately, is called Prologue, The Trouble with Nature. My aim in this lecture is to examine through a series of thematic studies how understanding of nature is intimately related to human interaction with the world and with each other. The representation is an attempt to respond to a deepening crisis in contemporary culture, in which rapid environmental erosion seems increasingly to reflect a corresponding deterioration in our sense of a common humanity. Peter Carl outlines the issues that underlie this crisis, and I quote, "As our scientific understanding of nature has broadened, our capacity to understand human culture as part of nature has diminished. It is as if human cultural life is supplementary to nature as system. Historically, we have moved from deification of nature to its exploitation, even abuse. and from an ethics situated in the natural conditions to a morality oriented around individual rights and emancipation from those conditions. Science necessarily contributes to the practical concerns of sustainability, but the ontological problem remains, since it is impossible to derive ethics from logical empirical statements of fact. End of quote. Recognising the extent of this ontological deficit today, we could view the destructive forces of climate change in apocalyptic terms as its finale, endpoint, the ramifications of which extend well beyond environmental concerns to fundamental questions about human existence, given our role in perpetuating the crisis. Seeking to understand nature in our current predicament invariably compels us to recognise that our technological age has propelled us into a state of estrangement from natural ways. Those conditions or situations that once cultivated human relatedness in a shared world. How we can address this challenge requires far more than scientific knowledge and technological ingenuity. As Carl indicates in the quote, it demands, I believe, a fundamental recalibration of how we address the question of nature as a historical problem, in which we are always already a part. Hence, I will approach the subject of this lecture indirectly to argue that the environmental crisis is much about the human condition in the modern age, what Hannah Arendt called appropriately Cartesian introspection, as about our growing uncertainty about what our relationship to nature ultimately means. A motivating influence in this investigation is Richard Sennett's book, Together, the Rituals, Pleasures and Politics of Cooperation, where he argues that forms of meaningful cooperation in our contemporary society are in short supply, in what he describes as an age of increasing intolerance, polarisation, the cult of individualism. The central premise of my argument is that this social malaise has a direct bearing on how we collectively respond to the environmental crisis. My focus in this study on aspects of the early modern age in Europe from the 15th to the 18th centuries is to demonstrate that this period highlights a decisive transition to a modern Western perspective of nature that corresponds to Dalibor Vesely's premise that the age is characterised by divided representation between transcendent and immanent worldviews. At the same time, the period also marks a shift in social practices from modes of human togetherness to increasing solitariness and introspection. Hans-Georg Gadamer believed that insight into the historical relationships between the human condition and nature can be found in the ancient world. And I quote, "We possess abundant evidence from Greek medicine to show us how the weather, the seasons, how temperature, water, and general sustenance, in short, how all possible climatic environmental factors were seen to make up the concrete ontological constitution of what it is that the physician helps to restore, namely health." The image I've just got here shows an Attic Roman relief of Dionysus, the god of wine, the god of pleasure, god of theatre, leading the horae, the personifications of nature. The dance of the horae defined the course of the seasons. In the emerging modern era, a particular attachment to nature as a form of escape or revelation served as the animating spirit of solitude, as we see, for example, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Meditations on Walking Alone in Imagined Wilderness. The image I hear is the wanderer above the sea of fog, a very well-known painting, of course. Most of us are familiar with this, Caspar David Friedrich. And Caspar David Friedrich famously stated, and I quote, "I must stay alone and know that I am alone to contemplate and feel nature in full." It's a precondition to be at one with nature, to be alone. That's a modern phenomenon. The pre-modern world, in contrast, broadly assumed natural conditions and all their multitude and rhythms as implicit in collective shared human existence. Given these vastly different perspectives, Seeking to find a singular concept of nature in this discussion is fraught with challenges. Raymond Williams famously stated the term is one of the most difficult to define in the English language. For the sake of simplicity, I will refer to the ancient Greek word for nature, hence the title of this lecture, or its nearest equivalent, physis, as a starting point which derives from the verb physis, meaning growing, becoming, or appearing. Understanding nature in these terms is useful, as I will demonstrate. Other definitions of nature will, of course, be examined in the course of the lecture. Aristotle identified a critical distinction between art and nature, techne and physis, that concerns the different efficient causes. Nature is essentially its own source of motion that develops around a specific end or telos, whereas techne always requires a source of motion outside itself. A critical shift in the balance between the regenerative forces of nature and human artifactual making between physis and techne occurred in the modern world, to the extent that techne, from its original ancient Greek meaning as the art or craft of making something, has been reduced to technological production and instrumental thinking, and in the process has absorbed and ossified physis into a readily available resource, or what Martin Heidegger famously described as standing reserve. We could interpret the environmental and cultural repercussions of this transformation by understanding the climate change in its manifestations as a series of unpredictable and extreme weather events or environmental events, as the Earth recoiling from relentless human exploitation, intimidating us in its wake, and eroding human and non-human flourishing. A daunting subject, perhaps, for an inaugural lecture. My intention, firstly, is to demonstrate the depth and complexity of this interrelated crisis, as I see it, that is enveloping all of us, even if we're not fully aware of it. And secondly, to identify ways in which we can learn from the past about how perceptions of nature were understood as implicitly a cultural and ontological concern. One of the consequences of the artificial transformation of the natural environment is that the very existence of nature itself is being contested in our modern technological world. We only need to refer to recent academic literature on the subject to realise the depth and scope of this uncertainty. These are just a selection. There are hundreds of these publications. In Carolyn Merchant's celebrated text, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology and the Scientific Revolution, the author takes a historical view of the plight of nature in the age of science, drawing on historical and feminist literature to explain how we've arrived in the modern age at the point of the death or virtual extinction of the natural world. This argument provides a counterpoint to a volume of essays by environmentalists and philosophers entitled Restoring Nature, Perspectives from the Social Sciences and Humanities, in which very different views are expressed about what it means to revive nature. This is given that untouched nature effectively no longer exists, and hence, according to some of the authors, any further human intervention, however well-intentioned, such as conservation initiatives or rewilding programs, should be resisted at all costs. These arguments are then taken up as a critical reference in Stephen Vogel's provocatively entitled book, Thinking Like a Mall, Environmental Philosophy After the End of Nature, in which the author inverts the famous motto of Aldo Leopold. He's a very eminent American naturalist and ecologist who once said as a book entitled Think Like a Mountain, in which humanity's relation to the natural world is likened to the interdependent ecosystems of a remote mountain setting. Vogel asserts that Leopold's analogy is untenable today, since the environment is essentially a built environment, or one that has been contaminated or even irretrievably altered by human actions. In essence, the end of nature has arrived, according to Vogel. He goes on to state, and I quote, "The dismaying consequences of the end of nature is that we can no longer imagine that we are part of something larger than ourselves." End of quote. This argument is further developed in Tim Morton's book Ecology Without Nature, who makes the case that the anthropocentric assumption of nature out there is something we observe and therefore at our disposal is incompatible with the interconnectedness underlying ecological thinking. Consequently, the very term nature should be abandoned altogether and replaced by an understanding of the synchronicity of all environmental elements, natural and human-made, including artificial intelligence. Morton believes, moreover, that nature writing is an illusion. In a world in which, he says, in a world in which one can find Coke cans in Antarctica. End of quote. I'll return to some of these arguments later in the presentation. Oh, by the way, that's the idea of thinking like a mall, it's a shopping mall. You probably guessed that in Vogel's text. Now, I'm going to be looking at three themes, three topics in the lecture. That was the introduction. I may not have time to look at the third one, depending upon the issue of time. The first one is called War and the Agon. The second one is called The Language Animal. And the third is perspectivization, or how perspective has drawn us into the notion or the illusion of a world picture. And then we may have to curtail parts of that depending upon the issue of time. So this is the first one, War and the Agon. All three themes are connected. Hopefully it'll become clearer. The eminent 17th century English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued in his famous book Leviathan that humans who engage in war and conflict retreat into natural or primitive conditions. For Hobbes, the civil war raging in England and the so-called 30 Years' War in continental Europe were symptomatic of society's regression into natural instincts, a claim that Immanuel Kant would later take up in the 18th century, although slightly differently, when he states that the discord of inner natural tendencies betrays man into further misfortunes through oppression of lordly power, the barbarism of wars, and the like. End of quote. Hobbes uses the phrase bellum omnium contra omnes, war of all against all, to convey this perennial state of conflict between the separation of humanity's moral life from its natural history, in which all humankind was essentially solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. End of quote. In order to put an end to the state of nature and these wars of religion, Hobbes makes the case that we need to shift towards the state with a capital S as a civilizing agent where humans can potentially live cooperatively and in peace. The frontispiece to Leviathan... Oh dear. Sorry. It's just gone off. Sorry, but I do apologise. I think I'll keep it there. What was I going to say? Yes, the frontispiece that we see here, it shows, the frontispiece provides a revealing iconographic rendering of Hobbes' theory of the social contract. In the upper register of the print, a giant crowned figure is shown emerging from a landscape, or emerging above a landscape of hills and villages, and a town below with orderly streets and cathedral with bell towers. The representation of an absolute sovereign ruler holding a sword and crozier, symbols of earthly and ecclesiastical power respectively, his body is composed of a multitude of smaller figures that make up the populace of the kingdom, giving the appearance of knights' chainmail appropriate, each oriented towards the sovereign in obedience. Rather than the rising, setting sun, the heavenly constellations or Christ the Pantocrator as registers of cosmic divine authority, the illustration shows instead the absolute and virtuous ruler, embodiment of the state as Hobbes saw it as new cosmocolossus. That's just a detail of it. Hobbes argues that in society's civilizing return to the state that requires us to overcome the forces of nature, war is tamed and ultimately transformed into other acts of human struggle and competition. Hence, human proclivity towards conflict is never eradicated, but rather managed and reoriented to more productive and constructive forms of social activity.
Looking back to the Renaissance, however, a rather different interpretation of nature can be found, as described by Leon Battista Alberti. And I quote, "Nothing shall be attempted that lies beyond human capacity, nor anything undertaken that might immediately come into conflict with nature. For so great is nature's strength that although on occasion some huge obstacle may obstruct her, or some barrier divert her, she will always overcome and destroy any opposition or impediment. And any stubbornness, as it were, displayed against her will eventually be overcome and destroyed by her continual and persistent onslaught." The image I've just got here is, for those of you probably know, the famous medal of Leon Battista Alberti, and this is the image of a flying eye, a winged eye, and it's supposed to be a pun on Leone Leon Battista Alberti. It's a lion's eye. It's the great insignia of Alberti, and this bronze medal demonstrates the notion of the piercing eye of an animal, a lion, freed from bodily constraint and given wings, serving as a metaphor of the power of human vision. So this idea that that nature serves as this kind of model of human capacity. Belief that the lion's eye was of such power that it did not decay with the death of the animal. So this idea of immortality with the lion becomes a very powerful emblem of Alberti, essentially. Alberti's gendering of nature in the quote, in this description, acknowledges a deep tradition from both classical and medieval thinking in which natural conditions align with female rather than male qualities. We can see later how this attribute as a form of deified nature nurtured social relationships during the Renaissance, which I'll refer to later. Alberti's claim that humanity is doomed to failure if it seeks to confront or overcome the forces of nature is in many ways prophetic of the modern age. His assertion should be understood in the context of the fervent belief among Renaissance humanists and artists that the so-called laws of nature serve as a fertile model for human creativity, to be emulated through architecture, poetry, city-making, and the visual arts. The origins of this understanding derive in part from the classical world, demonstrated in part in Aristotle's distinction between physis and techne referred to earlier. The shift from these earlier classical humanistic principles of a harmonic coexistence between human agency and the natural world to later scientific technological priorities transformed nature from an organism into a machine comprising bodily parts assembled for a specific purpose. To illustrate the reverberations of the modern separation between human agency and natural conditions, I refer to the opening passage of Michel Serres' book, The Natural Contract, in which the author uses a print of Francesco Goya's painting, Fight of the Cudgels, to illustrate human conflict and its environmental impact, but in such a way that discloses our fragility and precariousness. The painting portrays two bloodied combatants confronting each other in a swamp. In attempting to inflict the definitive blow on the enemy, both contestants are inadvertently sinking in the ground. Their complete and unwavering attention to winning the conflict at whatever cost means that they are effectively blind to the threat they are both unknowingly confronting. During the course of the battle, a third force is making its presence felt. Once background, seemingly passive to human exploitation, the ground, nature, is giving way in an act of defiance. Serres summarizes this acute situation in the following way, and I quote, "Yet quicksand is swallowing the duelists. The river is threatening the fighter. Earth, waters, and climate, the mute world, the voiceless things once placed as mere decor surrounding the usual spectacles, all those things that never really interested anyone, from now on thrust themselves brutally and without warning into our schemes and manoeuvres. They burst in on our culture, which had never formed anything but a local, vague or cosmetic idea of them, nature. What was once local, this river, that swamp, is now global, planet Earth." End of quote. This scene of escalating violence could be interpreted as an appropriate metaphor of Hannah Arendt's account of the human condition in the modern age referred to earlier. As human powers increase through technological advancement and scientific inquiry, we become less and less equipped to control the consequences of our action. If we can imagine a succinct way of conveying visually this combined existential and environmental crisis and its implications in our understanding of nature, we could probably do no better than this statement by Bruno Latour. By the way, this image is in Siberia. It's sinking buildings with melting permafrost, which is happening everywhere. And I quote, "If nature has become territory, it makes little sense to talk about an ecological crisis, environmental problems, or even a biosphere to be rediscovered, spared or protected. The challenge is much more vital, more existential than that, and also much more comprehensible, because it is much more direct. When the rug is pulled from under your feet, you understand at once that you're going to have to be concerned with the floor." End of quote. The description of the ground as a slippery rug on an unstable floor is laden with metaphors. Drawing our attention to the floor rather than the rug, Latour is suggesting that attempting to address the problem of, for example, of implementing sustainable agendas on our built infrastructure, the rug, simply ignores, bypasses the much deeper stratas of environmental destabilisation caused by human-inflicted climate change, the floor. At the same time, the territorialisation of nature that Latour describes, think, for example, of the legacy of the Enclosure Act, or modern planning policies that carve out so-called wilderness corridors, green belts, or even national parks, has inadvertently become, in modernity's pathological enframement, instrumentalised zones for demarcating places in which we seek escape within and outside cities. Not surprisingly, the pairing of nature with place has become a topic of heated debate among ecologists, environmentalists, and philosophers, where the fate of one is parallel to the fate of the other. I'll return to this matter later in the lecture. That image, I should have shown that image earlier on, sorry. This is just a reference to this idea of seeking sanctuary within the city, creating these kind of corridors or settings where the so-called natural world can be cultivated. Earth's recoiling in response to human actions reminds us of Martin Heidegger's relationship between Earth and world. The former denoting the physical realm that sustains all life, Earth, whilst the latter defines the different practices, values, and structures that humanity brings to bear on this Earth. In many ways, an attempt to reframe the Aristotelian principle of Physis and nomos, between the forces of nature and human custom, Heidegger explains the relation between both in his famous description of the strife between earth and world, in his 1935 essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. In German, der Riss means a crack, tear, or laceration. It also denotes a planned or drawn strategy. Combined, these two parallel meanings indicate how the strife between earth and world, from which a wound appears, offers the opportunity for scientific and technological measures to exploit, harvest, or extract what is revealed from within the sheltered earth. Sayers, like Hobbes, recognises that acts of war mutate into other forms of human rivalry and competitiveness, as seen in the corporate commercial world, for example, but that these acts, according to Sayers, nothing notable changes. What he calls, and I quote, the pursuit of military operations by other means, exploitation, commodities, money, information, with no end other than the common contractual quest for dominion over men and of nature. End of quote. There is, however, another way, of thinking about our relationship to fellow beings that attempts to avoid collective amnesia about human conditions, in which Sayre's bleak scenario of the swamp could be transformed into a common or shared ground, rather than exclusively a contested or conflictual one. A useful source in this thinking can be found in Gadamer's study of the Enigma of health referred to earlier. Gadamer believed that for humans to reach a state of wellness, the physician helps our bodies return nature to victory. In other words, illness constitutes a battleground against invading forces from outside, in which medical knowledge contributes to restoring the natural conditions of equilibrium. Hence, the shared focus of both physician and patient is on nature's balance. Importantly, Gadamer includes in this search for equilibrium all aspects of well-being, including human relationships. Basically, we are sociable beings. Gadamer implies that loneliness is unnatural. Gadamer's interpretation of nature's return to equilibrium chimes with Aristotle's assertion that physis, the ancient Greek word for nature, is always directed to an end state, a topos. We could think of climate change in this context as an accelerating state of disequilibrium between natural conditions and the human world, analogous to declining health or even terminal illness, of which the fate of our relationship to others and to the world forms an inextricable part, whatever the consequences, even our extinction. Seeking passage to a state of natural equilibrium in the pre-modern world, where a connection between nomos and physis was maintained, often involved agonic contests. Wendy Pullen provides a useful definition, and I quote, "Agon was regarded as both a procedure and a result that absorbed, structured, and manifested conflicting interests. It was manifested in terms of the social, commercial, ritual, and political functions, and through the architecture and urban fabric that embodied them." End of quote. Originating in the ancient Greco-Roman world in athletic contests or events, agonic practices also extended to temple sacrifices, tragic dramas, mock military sea battles, the making and judging of laws, and philosophical debates, as narrated in Plato's dialogues. The outcome of these events that signal a return to a state of harmony or reconciliation between opposing parties involved ritual, gestural acts of reconciliation, even a handshake. Importantly, the outcome was not exclusively a human matter, since the agon provided a stage where the divine forces of nature held sway over human actions and were reenacted as part of the context. I can't go through the details about this particular building. This building I know pretty well, but it provides a useful way of thinking about the agonic in the context of a built form. This is the famous casino of Pius IV by Piero Ligorio, who's a very well-known late Renaissance Mannerist architect and supposedly the first archaeologist. And here we see in this arena, this setting where debates actually took place, supposedly, we see reliefs where mythological scenes of the seasons, lunar, solar, and solar cycles constituted natural rhythms within which the deliberations of a very important council that was taking place at the same time that this building was constructed, vis-a-vis the Council of Trent in the late 16th century. And this arena, the casino, served as a model of what was hoped would be the favourable outcome of the Council of Trent to avert conflict. But of course, we know the result, the Counter-Reformation. So this kind of idea that you could construct the outcome by direct reference to favourable aspects of the natural order. Whilst in the modern age we no longer have the belief structures that were attuned to a deified nature, and against which human acts, however violent, were measured and ultimately judged, Peter Carl argues that, understood as a metaphor, the agon could be found in typical situations where, and I quote, "the cultural question, world, is posed in terms of the fundamental context, earth." End of quote. We could envisage this attention to earthly matters in all aspects of the human world, human-made world, and how they're judged and understood in relation to natural conditions, from the air we breathe to the earth we inhabit. Now, this is one thing I want to emphasize: this is what it's not. This is completely contrary to the argument that I'm putting forward. You probably know about the Earthshot Prize, part of a series, and this is recently televised, a recent event. I find this event disaster. I'll explain in a minute. The idea that a human contest to save nature, to save the world, to save the planet, to me is utterly perverse. Winners and losers. If you think about it, just how utterly absurd it is. Whatever good intentions, there's some fantastic entrance into the competition, but the way in which it's staged and presented, I think, gives a measure of the sheer poverty, impoverishment of contemporary culture about what exactly is at stake in our culture, in the world. It presents itself as a fashion show. It presents itself as the Mercury Prize or somewhere between the Academy Awards or Oscar Awards. And the only thing that we can see that has any indication on the stage it's actually about saving the planet is this strange green crown that's kind of hanging over the stage. I'll get back to that in a minute. In a different way of thinking about the notion of a crown as a manifestation of us and our relationship to the natural conditions. The closely interwoven environmental and human relational crises that I've just outlined serve as the backdrop to an examination of the role of language in the communicative sphere. Robert Pogue Harrison, this is the next section. Robert Pogue Harrison observes this relationship in the following way. It's a really interesting quote. He says, "The Greek word logos is usually translated as language, but more originally it means relation. Logos is that..." Oh, crikey. Sorry, it's just stopped again. Just switched off. It's gone off again.
No battery, I've got some more batteries.
Okay. Batteries. This is great.
Press that one and I'll change the battery.
Yeah, okay. Right. So I'm going to have to do an Earthshot presentation here. Yeah, that's fine. Oh, no. Yes, it's working. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So, basically, the Greek word logos... Is that working?
It's fine, you just need to keep it close to your mouth.
It's not working. That was not working either. I think it's run out. Sorry.
Just have a sec. Hello?
No, just went
Yep.
off. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
Close, yeah.
Logos is that which binds, gathers, or relates. It binds humans to nature. So language binds humans to nature. This is what the argument is. In modes of openness and difference. It is that wherein we dwell and by which we relate ourselves to this or that place. Without logos, without language, there is no place. Only habitat, no domus, only niche, no finitude, only the endless reproductive cycle of species being. No dwelling, only subsisting. In short, logos is that which opens the human abode on the earth. End of quote. Sorry. Okay, thanks. Claiming that language possesses these intrinsic qualities of relatedness to place and nature may seem very strange in our culture, our age of mobile technologies and silent modes of communication. Making sense of these relationships requires us to understand language as both spoken gestural and as written recorded forms of expression, because there's a difference. Gian Battista Vico believed in the 18th century that language came into being as reactionary gestures and utterances to natural events. That's the origin of language, according to him. Accordingly, in its most primordial sense, language was first and foremost a response to the mysterious forces of nature that defined all life. Some anthropologists argue that indigenous cultures, such as the Amazonians and Aborigines, believe their oral languages originate in the earth, in nature, rather than being a human invention. And only later, through the impact of urbanization and the invention of writing, that language becomes a separate communicative sphere. To understand the nature of this gradual emancipation of language from its original natural roots, if we like, as it was understood in the ancient world and with indigenous cultures, we should really refer briefly to Socrates, the illiterate philosopher who complained that the invention of writing leads one to forget. That remembering and handing down to later generations oral exchanges involves recollecting the original situation in which the dialogue or conversation took place. By the way, sorry, that's a papyrus, a very early 3rd century AD papyrus script with Greek letters on it. Just reference to what Socrates said. I put this in just as a kind of a pointer to reinforce the argument. This is a map of Australia. It's a very important map because it actually shows all the locations of the tribes of the Aborigines on the basis of languages and dialects. This is not a map of states. There's no states. There's no land ownership. The idea of the Aborigines have no concept of land ownership. This is merely the kind of broad zones, territories in which these languages and these oral cultures actually thrived. The boundaries were very fluid. And these indigenous cultures, actually, you could see the sheer complexity and richness of this map. It was only recent, the first findings or suggestion of this complexity actually started with the beginnings of colonisation of Australia. This has a particularly interesting point in recent events because in Australia there's been a number of major court cases about Aborigines trying to get an official apology from the Australian government about atrocities, genocide committed in the early part of the 19th century. The numbers are difficult to estimate, but we're talking about around 400,000 Aborigines murdered, executed by colonisers. And that the Australian government would not accept oral accounts. So these oral accounts in the 21st century were recorded through ancestral links. So these were father and son, grandfather or great-grandfather, communicating this information, saying this is where these atrocities actually happened in the different parts of Australia. And it took archaeologists to prove the evidence, not oral culture. And exactly what the Aboriginal tribes claim happened actually happened. Mass graves are being discovered. So this is a really good example of our misunderstanding about oral cultures. The importance attached to the setting or situation of oral cultures persisted throughout the medieval Renaissance period in Europe and became an important facet of humanist interpretations of language, in particular the vernacular languages, what's called volgare in Italian, in the civic life of the city. In Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia on common eloquence, that had a profound influence in civic humanism, the great Italian poet argued that the spoken language of the Tuscan dialect, as opposed to the mainly written form of Latin, was closer to nature, since it was always in a fluid, emergent state without fixed rules. We could say analogous to the Greek notion of Physis. Humanist interest in the skills of public speaking, where the setting of the speech, whether in a piazza, a garden, a basilica, or a palace, helped determine that the effectiveness of its delivery was supported by detailed knowledge of ancient literary works on oratory, such as Cicero's De Oratore, on the orator. Language, therefore, was always in the air as an animating spirit and formed part of a much larger ecosphere of natural and human-made rhythms, the seasons, along with canonical hours that gave order to urban life at this time. This is just an illustration of Dante, a famous painting, 15th century painting in Florence Duomo Cathedral, where he's standing with the open text of the Divine Comedy, which is, of course, written in Vulgate, in the vernacular. Sermons, mercantile negotiations, judicial debates, political speeches, religious sermons, poetry readings, along with the sounds of bell ringing, all form part of this rhythmic soundscape of the Italian city, described eloquently by Niall Atkinson in a recent fantastic book called The Noisy Renaissance. In essence, these are just images of the temporality, the time periods of bell ringing and how they related to seasons, but also how they related to the canonical hours I referred to. In essence, the civic dimensions of urban life and the surrounding natural rhythms coalesced. Indeed, were periodically synchronized in ways that offer insight into contemporary architecture, as Patrick Lynch suggests in a very interesting quote, and I read it here: civic architecture is obviously also the expression of civic values, and this derives as much from a response to solar orientation and the rhythms of the natural world as the expression of a building's use and its urban orientation. End of quote. How this three-way relationship between language, the civic realm, and natural rhythms flourished in the early modern world depended on a very particular form of human bonding that was quite different from our modern individualistic priorities. To explain the nature of this bonding, let me digress for a moment to describe a dispute between Martin Heidegger and his former student, Immanuel Levinas, that provides a useful philosophical context to this issue. The great philosopher Heidegger was accused by Levinas of lacking an ethics of Dasein. Of course, Dasein is the key element of Heidegger's phenomenology, basically the notion of being there or being in the world. Most specifically with respect to fellow human beings. This is the criticism of Levinas. The philosophical dispute centered around the difference between face-to-face and side-by-side relationships, which Levinas argues that Heidegger's phenomenology adhered more to the latter than the former. Essentially, forms of mutual coexistence between beings rather than an ethical obligation to the other, as expressed in face-to-face orientations. It is perhaps surprising that the only evidence we have of Heidegger directly addressing a face-to-face encounter is in relation to a tree, as highlighted in the following statement. I thought this would be an appropriate image if you know the story about this tree. And I quote, "We come and stand facing a tree. Before it, and the tree faces, meets us. Which one is meeting here, the tree, or we, or both, or neither? We come and stand just as we are, not merely with our head or our consciousness, facing the tree in bloom, and the tree faces, meets us as the tree it is." I think it's a beautiful quote. Heidegger, strangely, does not refer in this quote to a one-to-one relationship with the tree, but rather to the collective we who stand facing the tree, that then meets us. The mutual bonding of beings in this encounter, human and non-human, is of course rather different from the solitary wanderer or poet seeking contact with nature in the imagined wilderness. I referred, of course, to Rousseau and Caspar David Friedrich. There is an implication in Heidegger's description of nature, or elements of nature, that helps nurture human gathering, likened, for example, to the clearing in the forest as the notional first settlement, which is kind of described, of course, from Vitruvius onwards. It is as if this intersubjectivity, which Levinas identifies exclusively through face-to-face contact, is somehow conditional on our collective attunement to the so-called natural world, what Heidegger calls Earth. We could perhaps compare this conditionality with Latour's notion, Bruno Latour that is, of facing Gaia. There's a book of lectures that he wrote, in which he recognised the need somehow to give orientation in our relationship to nature as the basis for collective dialogue. This image I've just shown here almost went viral when it was put on the web. It was a photograph of a melting Norwegian glacier, and we see a crying figure, and it became known as the crying Mother Earth, or crying Gaia, Gaia, of course, is the Greek goddess of the earth, and became the standard bearer of Earth in the climate crisis, following, of course, James Lovejoy's famous Gaia theory of the Earth as a self-regulating system, but that's another story. Perhaps this conditionality is what Heidegger really meant by Dasein, this conditionality of relationship to the Earth, to the world, when he describes it having its own regionality, directionality, and bodily nature. Heidegger's account, however, serves as a useful counterpoint to an observation made by Gadamer, that intersubjectivity tends to drift into asymmetrical relationships, with a dominant player defined by the I and thou relationship, that drives situations of competition outlined earlier in the context of the agon, but without reconciliation. A dynamic, is what we see now in the modern age, essentially, a dynamic of imbalance, moreover, that also has a bearing on our relationship to natural conditions, as amply demonstrated in the current predicament with the climate crisis. Emphasizing instead the dialogical nature of human beings, Gadamer upholds Friedrich Hölderlin's bold claim that we, humans, are all conversation. Quote, we are just conversation. That's what we are as humans. But can humans, the big question, can humans have a dialogue with nature, as David Abram and others believe, or are we deceiving ourselves in the way Vogel asserts when he boldly claims that nature is essentially mute in our world as language animals? This question, which is beyond the scope of this lecture, prompts us, however, to think more deeply about what dialogue actually involves in our relationship with the other, whether human or non-human. An intersubjective understanding of dialogue offers a useful communicative framework when we ponder the issue of human bonding as an integral part of natural conditions, in the way Heidegger describes, rather than being separate as a social activity. It is a curious fact that in the current debates around climate change, the rapid depletion of the world's biodiversity and our professed desire to return to nature, in response to this crisis, we are repeatedly reminded that the environmental or ecologically conscious must be friends of Earth, of the Earth. See this time and time again, friends of something, friends of nature in some way. Or indeed that individuals who have passed away can be formally remembered in perpetuity as friends of a forest, a valley, a park, or just a view of a landscape through memorial inscriptions. It is no coincidence that park bench, where strangers can meet side by side and share a view or experience a memorable place, serves as the typical location of such inscriptions. Is the use of this term friend naive or simply sentimental? Or is there something significant that underlines this perceived attachment? In a series of recent publications by the American philosopher Brian Bannon, the author makes the case that nature is simply, and I quote, the name we give to the processes of spatialization and temporalization occurring between bodies, end of quote. And that this relational process makes no distinction between what is social and what is natural. Bannon uses the term friendship to articulate mutual acknowledgement of presence that requires places of encounter, as we saw earlier in the case of Heidegger's description of the tree. It also shifts the normative focus on ethical issues of nature, ethical responsibilities to nature, which has received some criticism in its anthropocentric assumption that humans serve as nature's custodians, to maintaining a relational autonomy of nature, wherein friendship preserves the independence of the other. In the modern world, friendship is commonly understood as exclusively a one-to-one relationship between equals, and that recognition of this bond is essentially a private matter between individuals. However, ancient teachings reveal something rather different. As seen in Aristotle's interpretation of philia, it's the nearest ancient Greek equivalent to friendship, modern friendship, that he believed played a central role in the stability and continuity of the Greek polis. More important even than the family. He emphasized that the friendship, philia, was much more important than your relationship to, your wife or your children or whatever. Greek philia was later to influence humanist understanding of friendship called amicizia. I use this as an illustration, School of Athens. Friendship defined by schools of thought. We talk about friendship as having a relationship with like-minded people. But the idea that groups of people are not kind of exclusive, but are fluid, so people can join or leave. So this notion of what a closed group of friends actually means, in this image, I think it's a really interesting way of conveying the civic dimensions of friendship that I've just tried to describe. Among the assumptions in this appropriation of classic ideas is firstly that friendship is a civic affair. Secondly, that it is communal rather than individually defined, kind of almost in the way that Heidegger describes. And thirdly, that it can be applied to the full spectrum of social relations, such as patrons, clients, lovers, commercial traders, family members, working colleagues, even pets. To understand how Renaissance views of nature and language help perpetuate this mode of friendship, I refer to a particular event that took place in 15th century Florence. This is going to come back to this notion of the crown over the stage in the Earthshot Award in a minute. Probably the most important architectural engineering accomplishment in Florence, and probably certainly in one of the most significant accomplishments in the Renaissance, in the early modern world, was the completion of the dome of the Duomo of Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. The architect of the dome, Filippo Brunelleschi, drew on the advice and the design of the structure from his contemporary and close friend Alberti, who stated, and I quote, "Imitate nature throughout, that is, bind together and interweave flesh with nerves, running along every possible section, so as to copy the ingenuity of nature," end of quote. The language that Alberti is using in this description of nature as a model for building relates to another commonly understood analogy between language and architecture, in which grammar is equated with a building structure, skeleton, whilst rhetoric, our delivery, our persuasive delivery, is consonant with its ornament, the building's embellished flesh. This language architecture analogy, moreover, complements another relationship that I believe informed Renaissance culture, namely between human bonding, amicizia, and Mother Nature. Friendship was not just a social relationship, but also formed an integral part of natural conditions, reinforcing Gadamer's interpretation of human health. Essentially, human health is about our relation to fellow human beings. Mary Garrard demonstrates in a recent book, Brunelleschi's Egg, Brunelleschi's Egg, Nature, Art and Gender in Renaissance Italy, the importance attached to Renaissance gendered concepts of nature as female, referred to earlier in the context of Alberti, in both architecture and the visual arts, in what was, of course, very much a patriarchal society. This can be seen most clearly in the symbolism of the dome of Florence Cathedral, which was dedicated, of course, to the Virgin Mary. The familiar story of Brunelleschi using an egg to demonstrate his solution to the dome, if anybody knows the story, it's very famous, during the competition to design the structure, needs to be understood as part of the common practice of suspending eggs over altars dedicated to the Virgin, as we see in this famous image, as a symbol of fertility and purity. This is, of course, the Brera altarpiece by Piero della Francesca. This is actually Madonna and Child with Frederica da Montefeltro. It's the upper half of the painting, so the other bit is missing, just to emphasize the egg. Brunelleschi's design for the dome has been compared to the familiar representations of the Madonna della Misericordia, Madonna of Mercy, in which her bellowing cloak serves as a protective enclosure for citizens of the city and its regions. Indeed, the Virgin Mary, or Saint Mary of the Lilies, translation of Santa Maria del Fiore, embodiment of Mother Nature, was seen as the protectress of Florence, ensuring its flourishing and safeguarding in times of unrest. This symbolism is especially pertinent in the context of Alberti's description of Brunelleschi's dome as casting a shadow over all of Tuscany, as if the sheltered space within the basilica becomes a microcosm of the city and its outlying regions. This implicit relationship between architecture, female deified nature, and civic religious life provides a symbolic context for an important contest, an egonic event, to celebrate the dome's completion. In the competition called the Cettima Coronario, coronary coronary or crowned contest, was organised by Alberti himself. And it was a poetry competition to decide on the best poem about friendship. And that all the people who competed in this competition, everything from theologians to artists to humanists, were actually asked to produce a poem, to recite a poem in the Vulgate, not in Latin, but in the Vulgate, the common language of the people, within the dome of this great structure, to celebrate friendship. And each included friendship of Christ. So we had theologians actually pontificating that Christ also is a great friend. So in the context of this event, and of course I should say, when the competition came to an end and the decision about who should be received the laurel crown, who do you think received it? Nobody. It was given to the dome. The dome was crowned. Perfect demonstration of what I'm trying to argue. See, in the context of the Church by Coronaria, the idea of the spoken word as defining a common ground for collective involvement has particular resonance and will be attempt to trace the transformations of the city through the agency of language, from the clearing settlement in a forest to the boundless conurbation. If we dwell not in nature, as many assume, but in relation to nature, then how is this understood in the context of the emergence of the modern city? Robert Harrison, earlier quoted in his text, ponders this question in the following intriguing statement. As the order of institutions follows its course, or as huts give way to villages and then to cities and finally to cosmopolitan academies, the forests move further and further away from the centre of the clearings. At the centre, one eventually forgets that one is dwelling in a clearing. The centre becomes utopic, a utopia, as a kind of compensation, in a sense. The wider the circle of the clearing, the more the centre is nowhere, and the more the logos, language, becomes reflective, abstract, universalistic. In essence, ironic. Yet, however wide the circle may get through the inertia of civic expansion, it presumably retains an edge of opacity, where history meets the earth, where the human abode reaches its limits, and where logos, language, preserves its natural grounding. As the founding location of language, the clearing and the forest, the gradual introspection and irony of language takes hold. When the forests disappear from the horizon, and bodily gestures give way to abstract signs, and ultimately to our now universal digital text. Substitutes are then sought within the metropolis, in the territorialised and artificialised terrains of municipal parks, allotments, rewilded landscapes, where new forms of social linguistic exchange are cultivated as a shelter from urban life, as a kind of escape from urban life, which I kind of suggested earlier. The Central Park is a really good example. You know, Frederick Law Olmsted, this is obviously an aerial view of it, called the park a lung of the city. It's a really interesting kind of metaphor to convey the recovery of air, both to breathe and to speak, which is kind of to speak naturally. This is the implication which I'm trying to convey. Or indeed, we look at something much more recent in the art urban by Atelier l'Architecture in Paris, Doina Petrescu and her collaborators, where a former parking lot becomes a place of cultivated land to channel social interaction. So this idea that actually, growing vegetables in the middle of a city, formerly occupied by a dense urban fabric, a clearing of a space, the idea of clearing the space in the way that Harrison talks about the original city, we kind of reinvest that idea in the city itself. It is easy to see how in the modern city, irony challenges long-held preconceptions of place, especially when these are entangled in false notions of historical significance. Underlying this phony commemorative plaque and its writing amusing message, basically, on a particular date, nothing happened, is something significant about how we think about place in response to Harrison's trace of the gradual loss of centre in the expansion of the city. Heidegger believes that the coming into being of place involves a happening, or as Jeff Malpass describes in his interpretation, occurrence in proximity is itself an occurrence in and of place. It is an occurrence that needs no special such place, not a physical place, but rather the happening that of a place as such. The idea that place requires some event that actually unfolds, a happening that unfolds. And in Heidegger calls this taking place of place ereignis. And I'm just using this as a very crude diagram. This is Jeff Malpass reinterpreting Heidegger's concept of the fourfold. If you don't know the fourfold, it's a fundamental principle of Heidegger's philosophy, where ereignis is basically the constellation of these forms of connection between mortals, gods, not religious gods. We're not talking about religion here, but a kind of higher order, and between earth and sky. And the constellation of these things gives rise to a kind of happening. This is the essential event that's being presented here. Place presupposes the coming together of beings, human and non-human, that gives rise to a happening, whether in the form of reaction or encounter, in the way Vico describes in the context of the first language or proto-language. However, like the term nature, some ecologists and environmental theorists, are contesting the very idea of place in the age of the Anthropocene, urging us instead to think globally. Implied in Sayre's description referred to earlier, what was once local, this river, that swamp, is now global, planet Earth. And to conceive what Ursula Heiss calls, and I quote, an eco-cosmopolitan openness. This is based on the premise that we no longer have ties to local places, but instead ties to territories and systems that encompass the planet as a whole. The assertion that effectively promulgates an alternative to a sense of place, probably in its more narrow sense, called planetarity, has of course significant implications not just in our understanding of nature, as I've tried to explore here, and language, but more crucially, architecture. My contention is that this argument is misguided, since the current crisis I've just outlined compels us to recognise that environmental destruction and our growing uncertainty of a common shared humanity, of which our situatedness in the world is fundamental, are effectively the same crisis, since one has contributed to and exacerbated the other. Hence, to address the ontological problem that Carl highlights in the quote used at the beginning of this lecture, we must recognise how the relationship between place, as it is at least interpreted by Heidegger and Malpass as a coming together of human, non-human entities rather than specific fixed locations, and natural conditions are intimately entwined. Without one, there isn't the other. I may be accused of being anthropocentric in this assertion, but it seems to me that care for the planet in its totality, or what Peter Slotchevik calls famously its sphericity, requires care for each other as situated beings on this earth. I'm not going to go into the next section because I've run out of time, but I'm going to just provide a conclusion to what I've just outlined. So I have to forego the section on perspective. What I've tried to explore here, these different themes of human conflict, looking at human conflict and rivalry, and ways in which natural conditions or natural rhythms can ensure a return to harmony, the agonic, as I've referred to, and how this relates to also to the question of language and its relationship to our sense of place, our sense of gathering as an event or as a happening, seems to me to be absolutely fundamental to how we challenge this crisis, or how we address this crisis. And it's something that it's significantly important to me, because it's something I've absorbed and thought about quite a lot. I just want to go, if I may, jump to a building, and it'll take me 1 second to go through. Would that be all right? This is a building actually by Caruso St. John Architects, and provides a really interesting reference to thinking architecturally about the problem. The Island Project was the British entry for the Venice Biennale in 2018, and it was curated by Carissa St. John, but in collaboration with the artist Marcus Taylor. It's called The Island, appropriately. And in a way, it provides a very interesting, useful way of thinking spatially, thematically about the crises that we face. Of course, its conception in 2018 was on the just soon after the Brexit vote. All sorts of implications in the way we talk about Ireland, both nationally in terms of where Britain lies outside Europe, but also how we think about it in terms of climate change. This is, of course, the great British Pavilion in Venice for the Biennale, and what we see is a conception of how we intervene in this building to deal with these multiple, as Peter St. John recognised, and how it was presented, certainly in the description, interpretation of this building, a series of crises, both environmental but also cultural, political, is that we have this construction of a giant scaffold in which a platform is built on its roof. And this is a photograph of the installation. So you have a temporary installation, but within inside the building is disemboweled. That's the kind of theme. These are just a kind of imaginary scenes of what the space, inner space would be like. So the idea that basically Venice is flooded. So the whole terrain, the ground floor, the earth of Venice no longer exists. So we have this idea of a kind of wasteland. Architecture is disemboweled. It becomes functionless, emptied. Its history is removed, is erased. And what we're left with is its roof as this kind of temporary structure, removing oneself away from the everyday existence, activities or life of the city, to creating, and this is in reference to the section I didn't do on perspectivization, what Alberti talks about, the idea of the Albertian grid, this idea of the tabula rasa that serves as the datum for reinventing from scratch a new culture, a new beginning. What is interesting about this particular building is that it was a project or an installation that run in tandem with a series of curatorial projects. So it was all about human engagement, it's all about conversation, it's about dialogue, it's about sociability of architecture. So it seems to me that something really interesting about how we think about this building as a kind, or this installation as a testimony to these multiple crises that we are facing. So I'd just like to read a quote. Sorry, that happens afterwards. To read a quote from Sayre's book, Natural Contract, and this is the last page of the book. To me, it's resonant. You may find the comments that he makes very strange. But this idea of human relationships and our relatedness to the natural world, how intimate that can be, and how that manifests itself in what he describes as our joint quaking. He says, and I quote, "Who am I? A tremor of nothingness, living in a permanent earthquake. Yet for a moment of profound happiness, the spasmodic earth comes to unite herself with my shaky body. Who am I now? For several seconds, earth herself. Both communing in love, she and I, doubly in distress, throbbing together, joining in a single aura." End of quote. Thank you.